We're going to move on to Don Johnson. And Don Johnson, to quote Dick Ellis, who was an important Wisconsin conservation writer in his own right, said that Don L. Johnson was one of Wisconsin's most talented outdoor writers and conservationists. His work as a tenacious investigative reporter and as an extraordinary painter of life outside still matters to anyone who appreciates the outdoors, wildlife, and the environment. Another important writer in Wisconsin, environmental outdoors writer Jay Reed, says that his dealings with the heavy stuff of conservation are legend. And those two quotes are on the plaque here, and with that, I will turn it over to the speakers. Don was nominated by Dave Carlson, and we have three speakers today. It's going to be Doug Johnson, Don's son, Dave Carlson, and Paul Smith. So I think we'll turn it over to Doug first.
Thank you, Michael John. It's a pleasure to be here with you today in the company of my sister, Lynn Carlson, and her husband, Kurt Carlson, my wife, Carolyn Johnson, my cousin, John Swenson, and his wife, Cindy, to honor the life and conservation legacy of my father, Don L. Johnson. Outdoor writer Jay Reed, the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame 2014 inductee, wrote this in 1984. Johnson was and is one of the most respected conservation voices ever to be sounded in Wisconsin, which puts him in the company of the likes of Gordon McCrory, Ernest Swift, Aldo Leopold, and Mel Ellis. He has more than earned the right to be included in that kind of company. Anybody who hunts or fishes in Wisconsin, or enjoys any of the outdoor recreation that this state provides, owes this man something. I think he's the best there is at what he does. In 2000, in Wisconsin Outdoor Journal, Tim Isley included Don among the Century's Honor Roll, a compilation of the 20 people who influenced Wisconsin hunting and fishing most during the previous century. Now, in this brief time, I will further summarize my father's conservation legacy, but I've also been encouraged to talk a little about some of the other aspects of his work and the very interesting life that he led. Don Lloyd Johnson was born in 1927 in Milwaukee to Madeline and Harvey Johnson. He attended school in Milwaukee and West Dallas. Despite these urban roots, urban origins, he was a country boy at heart from an early age. He spent much of his boyhood on his paternal grandparents' farm, and it was on the wooded bluffs and sloughs of Buffalo County where his lifetime love of the outdoors was deeply instilled. He told me, I always considered Buffalo County to be my roots rather than the Milwaukee area. By age 9, my dad was hunting alone with a beat-up 22 single-shot rifle. He brought home squirrel and other game for the stew pot. In those Depression days, that was no small thing. And also during this formative period, my father read the works of Gordon McCrory, the pioneer outdoor writer for the Milwaukee Journal. And he told me once, it looked to me like McCrory had it pretty well figured out. He went hunting and fishing and got paid for it. So I decided that's what I wanted to do. Dad dropped out of high school and enlisted in the Navy during the Second World War. He was instructed in gunnery, and in 1945, at age 17 or 18, he was a petty officer in charge of a 5-inch gun. Did some wing shooting out in the South Pacific. On his discharge in 1946, on the discharge paper, there was a line for future job preference, and it said journalism. For the next four and a half years, Don continued his education, interspersed with breaks in which he worked various jobs and did some traveling around the country on a motorcycle. At the University of Wisconsin in Madison, he completed the requirements for a degree in journalism, but he also earned so many credits in biological sciences, natural resources, and the like that it amounted to a double major. In 1949, Don married our mom, Lorraine Sen of Buffalo County, and they were joined by Douglas in 1951 and Lynn in 1952. Here's a family circa 1960. Now, Dad graduated from the UW-Madison in January 1951. He was hired shortly after that by the Eau Claire Leader and Telegram, initially as a general assignment reporter. He's shown here with Fred Steffen, a longtime editor of that paper, who also became a lifelong friend of my father's. And this photo was taken in May of 1951, not long after he was hired. Now, quite soon after my father joined the staff of the Leader Telegram, a lot of outdoor news started appearing in that paper. In fact, it wasn't long before every Thursday there was a page devoted to it. And here's an example from 1952, covering detailed matters of conservation issues, regulatory issues, and so forth. It wasn't very long after that an outdoors column over my father's byline started to appear on that page, and perhaps at other times as well. And this is the original logo. The earliest I could find online was from March of 1952. There may have been something a little earlier. It ran under this logo initially, backflashes and muzzle flashes. And that artwork is also my father's hand. So then this is really the point where his conservation legacy in the public sense really began. And from the very beginning, these columns, there were columns about where the fish were biting and how the deer season was shaping up, but these were heavily interspersed with information about conservation policy, regulatory issues, wildlife management, habitat preservation, right from the beginning. And right from the beginning, he did not shy away from forceful advocacy. And there's an example of the early column on the page, on the outdoor page, in the Daily Telegram. And this particular column from March of 1952 was somewhat typical. It was a call to arms regarding certain types of development projects, which Don argued were unnecessarily sacrificing important wildlife habitat, and in which demanded, he argued, better organized resistance by conservationists. Now, within a couple of years, that muzzle flashes logo was set aside and replaced with the more straightforward outdoors with Don L Johnson, and this what became kind of a trademark photo with the pipe. And the pipe is also seen in this photo from about 1957. At the end of a successful fishing expedition. I don't honestly remember if I helped land some of those, but I was clearly happy to share in the credit. But this column from 57 is again typical. It's about, this is something that was submitted in the nomination packet as an example of his writing during that era. He vividly describes the sweeping changes that humans have wrought on the natural environment of Wisconsin just in the 5 generations since our ancestors arrived here in Buffalo County in the early 1800s. And it reflects in this column, we must realize how much we had, how much we have lost. In the year 1957, we are still figuratively and literally losing ground. Now, he did all this outdoor writing on top of his regular reporting and editing assignments, which increased as the years went on. But it was the conservation writing that drew notice outside the immediate region. And indeed, by 1961, then Governor Gaylord Nelson wrote to thank Don for helping, quote, to enact my $50 million crash program to preserve Wisconsin's vast and endangered natural resources. Your editorial backing played an important role in the legislative adoption of this program. And then in 1960, there was a real breakthrough or turning point, which is my father won the 3rd annual Gordon McCrory Award in recognition of distinguished writing for telling the conservation story. That distinction in turn opened the door to his being hired in 1962 as the outdoor writer for the Milwaukee Sentinel. And that job, which my dad had full-time for 23 years, was really a great job for Don Johnson. Full-time writing on hunting, fishing, resource issues, environmental issues. Here's a promotional display at the Milwaukee Sentinel headquarters. Now, certainly, there was quite a range of his work during his years at the Sentinel. Certainly, he excelled at what's sometimes called the hook and bullet coverage, feature stories and columns about hunting, fishing, boating, and the like. And there was a large audience for that component of his writing around the state in that era. There were even a few occasions where his teenage son was featured as he reached minor milestones in his development as a hunter. But always there was a great deal also of coverage on regulatory issues, public policy issues. And indeed, there were periods when my father spent more time on the road, even hundreds of thousands of miles a year, driving to commission meetings and committee meetings of various types than he did in the woodlands during some periods, because he believed that it was vital that the public receive timely and accurate information on matters that would determine how much of the rich natural heritage of the state would be preserved for future generations. Don told Jay Reed in 1998, I never wanted anyone to forget that I was a reporter whose assignment went far beyond the acts of hunting and fishing. And as I understand it, his willingness to devote that amount of time and energy to monitoring and reporting on regulatory policy matters made him a force to be reckoned with on those issues during that era. Jay Reed wrote in 1998, his career blazed a superhighway through a decades-long tangled web of political and scientific underbrush toward the lofty pinnacle atop which the state's conservation community now sits. His fingerprints can be found on both federal and state conservation regulations. Some are part of the basic policy that governs the management of Wisconsin's fish and game. His dealings with the heavy stuff of conservation are legend. End of quote from Jay Reed. But Don Johnson also became a pioneer in environmental investigatory reporting. Bill Berry, in his book Banning DDT, How Citizen Activists in Wisconsin Led the Way, devoted much of a chapter to Don's role as the first to break the story of DDT in Wisconsin fisheries. As Mr. Berry put it, the issue, quote, went white hot in early 1966. Don Johnson shook things up with a series of articles on DDT concentrations in Wisconsin's lakes and streams. State fish swimming in DDT waters, read one front page story. And there you see it right there, the initial story in the series of investigatory reports. To continue with Mr. Berry, Don Johnson continued to hammer away at the DDT story despite threats of lawsuits and demands by chemical companies that he be fired. Other environmental exposés and investigatory series followed in the subsequent years on mercury pollution in the waterways from paper plants, PCB contaminations, acid rain, and others. Some of Dad's investigative reporting and advocacy certainly had an impact beyond the borders of Wisconsin. For example, his writing critical of an Army Corps of Engineers development plan for the Cache River Basin in Arkansas resulted in the preservation of habitat that 2 decades later produced intriguing reports of sightings of the ivory-billed woodpecker, a species that has long been regarded as extinct. I wanted to mention also that starting very early in his long career, Don knew and learned from some of the giants of the preceding generation of conservationists. When he took his final years of instruction at UW-Madison in the late 1940s, he told me the ecological movement was just starting to take off, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus had a lot of the leaders of the movement. So he met Aldo Leopold, and no doubt would have become well acquainted with him, but for Leopold's untimely death in 1948. He knew such figures as Ernest Swift, Wallace Grange, Joseph Hickey, and Circuit Olson, with whom he's shown here. Dad often traveled to other parts of the United States to fish or hunt. For example, he canoed through the Okefenokee Swamp in 1973. And during the Sentinel years, the paper, he made at least 5 trips to Alaska during those years. It was a place he truly loved. In 1976, he was dropped alone in the wilderness and spent a couple of weeks canoeing out with various adventures along the way, including a memorable encounter with a grizzly bear, a trip written up in a series called Alaska Alone. But the paper also encouraged him to take trips to foreign locales every few years. The readers seem to love these exotic locations, places like Great Bear Lake, Cuba, Costa Rica, and in 1984, Kenya. George Cassidy, ace photographer, accompanied my father on many of these foreign trips and took a number of these images. This was not a hunting trip, this was touring, exploring, and may have done some fishing. He went to Ecuador in 1978 and boated down the Amazon. Here he is fishing in the rapids. I used to kid him about this picture. I called it the Great White Hunter picture on the Amazon, but it was not a hunting trip. I think they were watching for crocodiles there. He enjoyed going to those places, but Wisconsin was his first love. Jay Reed wrote, although Johnson has fished in some of the world's most exotic places, his favorite fishing remains fly casting for bluegills on any given secluded pond in Wisconsin. I also need to briefly mention my father's love for dogs. He never had more than 1 dog at a time. But he had an extraordinary rapport with these canine friends. There was Dash in the 1960s, then came a remarkable Springer Spaniel named Chips, who was born in 1973. The very poignant story as Chips reached his final days, died in 1985. And then finally there was Brighton, a German short-hair hunting dog par excellence. These canine friends became very well known to my father's readership around the state. They were an important part of his life. Dad had a special love for grouse hunting. He once said, if God could have made a better bird than the ruffed grouse, he would have, but he didn't. He wrote this book on grouse and woodcock hunting, which in 1985, which is well received by that community. He knew a lot about hunting guns. He wrote technical articles for Gun Digest and other publications. one other thing, one other way that Dad expressed his deep love of Wisconsin nature was through short nature essays, which the Sentinel published from time to time, often starting on the front page, as you see that one did. That particular one's about an old tamarack tree on our property, a tamarack tree that died. And these essays had quite a readership around the state, including a lot of people who didn't follow the Hook and Bullet stories. The editors were always happy with the kind of mail they got when they ran one of these. Many of them were written about walks taken on 9-acre property in Waukesha County, where the family lived from the mid-60s until 1991, and a creek running along one border of it. And he would take a walk and often come back and write one of these little essays. In 2005, he published this collection of these short nature essays, which got a lot of very positive reviews. He was also a very accomplished photographer of Wisconsin nature scenes of all types. Dad now moved back to Menominee in 1991. During the final years of his life, Dad was increasingly burdened by some serious health issues, and yet he remained active in these outdoors activities until very near the end, which came in January of 2006 at age 78. During the last year or two of life, many honors came his way. Here he is shown at the National Convention of the Outdoor Writers Association of America in 2005, receiving a Career Achievement Award. In a 2004 family oral history interview, we asked Dad if he felt he had spent his working years in the right field, and he answered as follows. Yes, I was offered more money to do other things over the years, but I took a lot of satisfaction in doing what I was doing, because I felt that I was not only contributing to the conservation of the resources, but was also teaching people to be more respectful of nature. We're proud to be with you today to honor this teacher. Now I'd like to turn this over to a good friend of my father's, Dave Carlson, who nominated him for this honor that he's receiving today. Dave?
Presentation. It was very comprehensive too, because Paul Smith in the Journal and I are sitting there, well, scratch that, well, scratch that, well, scratch that. No, thank you for sharing those wonderful memories of your father and the photos and all the things that you've shown us. Some of this, as I said, will be border a little bit on repetitive, but Don was born in the West Dallas, at West Dallas of southeast Minnesota, or southeast Wisconsin, excuse me. A city kid with a hunger for the outdoors adventures. His boyhood days spent in the world away at grandparents' farms in the Buffalo County, Cooley country, where his curiosity would find wisdom, confidence in what he would become and what his words would become. Today he's in Shrine Place celebrating the giants of Wisconsin's conservation legacy, and their message is sounding in different ways in different parts of the state in different periods. The thread, though, linking all of them, I believe, is courage. Enduring examples of how one can make a difference, how one can make a difference. After he had retired from the Sentinel, Johnson often accepted my invitations to hit the road with us as I and photographers went around the Midwest gathering materials for stories. with storyteller Johnson riding shotgun. He never came close to losing the wheel or falling asleep. He had wonderful stories. Often I wish I had a tape recorder for him to capture some of those things. From Wisconsin publisher Dick Ellis's biography series on Johnson, we learned that in 1966 Johnson launched an intriguing one-year investigation backed editorially by good bosses. As Johnson told it, it began with an unexpected encounter. He was speaking to a conservation club in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, and the local fisheries official came up to him afterwards and said that he had some bad news for Don. That he said he was scared because he told Don he had evidence that there were lakes in Wisconsin that were not producing viable muskie eggs after having produced them for years. Johnson asked him what was going on, and the fisheries official said he didn't want to talk. He didn't want to talk. He said it was up to Don to find out. Well, true to his investigative instincts, Don started asking questions that led to more questions, and a scarcity of answers. He suspected collusion. At one point, Don recalled how he got hard data on harmful wildlife and fishery exposures from DDT. Somewhere I heard the story firsthand on North Dakota, wherever we were going. And Don told it this way to Dick Ellis. He was having a visit with Walter Scott, who was enshrined in this hall. And Scott knew what he was there for. He told Don he was going to leave the room. He'd be back in 10 minutes. Don said he grabbed a file of papers and started sifting through it upside down so it was not to be confused with it. That he had been snooping. And for 10 minutes or better, who knows, he took notes. Scott emerged back in the room and asked Don if he had got what he needed. Don said yes. Then Scott told him, well, you didn't get it from me. Johnson's eventual reporting on DDT's impacts led to Wisconsin becoming the first state, as Doug told you, and the story is well documented in the Berry book. But he also did, besides blowing the whistle on DDT and other pollutants, his reporting challenged the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers proposed ditching and draining of the Case River bottomlands in Arkansas. He also conducted testing showing the dangers of lead poisoning, as you saw in the headlines there. His writing methods were simple, just inform, educate, and entertain. Don said in every column, regardless of the topic, he tried to work in something about the environment and how to take care of it. He also promoted newspapers giving more coverage to diverse outdoor issues, which tended to impact all readers, whether they hunted or fished. Ellis quoted Don as saying, he never asked for more money, he asked for more space. And that's something I craved too when I was in the TV or the newspaper business. And it's sad to see what's come of some of the pages of our newspapers when it comes to outdoors reporting. Don preferred bird hunting alone, but he also enjoyed companionship with other hunters and their dogs. People like Dan Werner, who were now in Wisconsin. Dan, I asked him, and Joe, and I did too if he could be here today. He couldn't, but he did share some wonderful memories, especially about the old ace of the hole spot near Iron River for 10 years. He and Don enjoyed some of the best woodcock and grouse hunting imaginable. And then there was Larry Kalina, a Menominee barber for many years, who took Don as a regular customer after Johnson moved back to Menominee after retiring. There was something special about Don, Kalina told me. The first time he came in the shop, he was dressed like a gentleman. He had that look. And guys would come here and sit by and listen to all of his stories. A duck hunting friend, Ray Heidel of Alaska, recalled that even stricken with tumor-causing Parkinson's disease, Don enjoyed going out in the marsh with Ray and his son. And when Don pulled up a gun, Ray said, he was still rock solid. I recall in a trip to North Dakota, duck and grouse hunting, we slept in the farm with friends, machinery building. Sometime during the evening, Don's vintage wooden cot broke. And we were showered with words you'd never see in one of his comments. One day, the Johnson family arranged for most of his personal outdoors gear to be auctioned off to benefit the Dunn County Fish and Game Club. Hundreds showed up, and the bidding for many items was very generous, sometimes too much so, but no one complained. Just like his articles and his columns, his books, they were getting a piece of the man, an outdoors giant. And now I'd like to introduce Paul Smith of the Milwaukee Journal to talk about Don's professional career.
Good afternoon. What a grand occasion. I was driving up here today and I saw an exit on the interstate for Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. What a great state we live in. Made me proud to be a Wisconsinite. I don't know how many states could claim this, but here we are, and what a beautiful ceremony. I'm Paul Smith, Outdoors Editor for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. It's an honor to be with you today in this celebration of life in Wisconsin, as we recognize Scott, Don, and Eroline for their rich contributions to the virtues we hold so dearly in this Badger State. In a word, conservation. And it's a special honor to be able to speak about Don. I want to extend my sincere thanks to the Johnson family and to the Conservation Hall of Fame staff for inviting me. Like most celebrations of life, it falls to the living to bear witness. I am here to bear witness to Don's legacy. I'm standing before you, but please know I'm speaking on behalf of George Stanley, my executive editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and a former outdoors writer himself, past and present employees of our newspaper, including dozens of outdoors writers and environmental reporters, and really every reader who was touched by Don's work. In a world in which partisan and ideological divisions seem to widen by the day, your induction of Don is a shining exception. Everyone, and I mean everyone, I talked to is thrilled and 100% supportive of your decision to add Don's name to this august list. As you might expect, I've been thinking about Don a lot lately. And by the way, that's a happy place. Don left a lot of trails in Wisconsin for all of us. Just this past Monday night, my path crossed one of Don's again. I was at the spring hearings in West Dallas, Milwaukee County, Nathan Hale High School. It's Don's alma mater. It was the 25th time I've covered the spring hearings, but I'm just a spring chicken. I wondered when I sat in that auditorium how many times Don must have covered the spring hearings. Well over 30, I'm sure. How many times that he sat in that auditorium as a student and as a reporter. My presence at that place, in my role, had Don's boot tracks and superb writing all over it. Let me share a personal story that bears witness to the power of Don's work. As a boy with a love of the outdoors growing up in the 1960s in southeastern Wisconsin, I was doubly blessed. Not only did my siblings and I have unqualified permission to fish, hunt, roam, swim, climb, and generally explore the creek, pond, fields, and woods around our Racine County home, but our parents subscribed to 4 daily newspapers. I learned that these black and white treasures contained writers who had similar interests to mine. And they weren't restricted to the distance they could walk in a day. They had automobiles, boats with outboard motors, and expense accounts. They covered the whole state, the continent, and beyond. I memorized the publication schedules of the various outdoors writers, and when a paper arrived, would wrestle my siblings for dibs on the appropriate section. Paper in hand, I plopped down on the family room floor to devour the latest entries. Our circulation area was loaded with all-stars of the outdoor writing universe. Among the Illuminati were Mel Ellis, Bill Stokes, and Jay Reed of the Milwaukee Journal, and John Huszar from the Chicago Tribune. And then there was another writer who I came to know possessed what I believe was the greatest range of talent and whose work arguably had the most significant impact on the Wisconsin conservation community and the state's environment of any in that era. Of course, it was Don Johnson. A man's man with a sensitive touch, Johnson worked as outdoors writer, as you've heard, for the Eau Claire Leader-Telegram from 1951 to 62 and from the Sentinel in Milwaukee from 1962 to his retirement in 1984. Johnson showed an environmental awareness long before the first earthquake. Much of our future has been squandered, Johnson wrote in a 1957 column. We must dig deep and work hard to save and increase what we have. Of his work as a journalist, he said, we must interpret hard facts into plain language and then act. While in Milwaukee, Johnson became well known and respected by those at the city's other major daily newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal. You've heard earlier what Jay Reed had to say. In Jay's opinion, Don's work put him in the lights of Gordon McCrary, Ernest Swift, Alva Leopold, and Mel Ellis. And anybody who hunts and fishes in Wisconsin owes this man something. I echo Reed's sentiments, but there's even more to Johnson that merits him for the highest honors. In my view, none of the other outdoor writing giants in Wisconsin, each richly deserving in their own right, with a place in the Hall of Fame, provided as wide a range of skills as Johnson. He certainly could write the colorful feature story that transported the reader into the outdoors. The bear had seen me first, that much was certain. So why was it still coming my way? Johnson wrote in 1976 for the introduction to a series titled Alaska Alone. I was one of the tens of thousands of readers who could not tear his eyes away from that story. To our great benefit, most of Johnson's stories were focused on Wisconsin. Here he's hiking the North Country Trail. But he also traveled frequently to regional places, like the Boundary Water Canoe Wilderness. And, as you've heard, he had the support of editors who traveled the world. What an era in newspaper journalism. Ecuador, Canada, Alaska, Africa. And what a treat to join Don vicariously on all of his adventures. Johnson was also the consummate newsman, diligently covering conservation meetings across the state for the entirety of his newspaper career. And as a rare and true triple threat, Johnson proved to be a star investigative reporter. As you've heard, his work to uncover pesticide pollution in the 1960s, which state officials had tried to conceal, led to real change. Based partly on Johnson's reporting, DDT was banned first in Wisconsin, a milestone we'll always be proud of. But he also helped reveal threats of high mercury levels in our waters in fish, as well as lead poisoning in marshes and waterfowl. His work on that last issue helped federal officials ban lead shot for waterfowl hunting. Like all great journalists, Don was fiercely honest and faithful to the truth. He also wasn't afraid to point out transgressions of fellow sportsmen. In a trip to the Arctic, he found trash at a fishing site used by just 2 years by visiting anglers. This too found its way into his reports from the north. And in an age of increasing technology, Don seemed to retain a high value for silent sports. As a kid, if I saw Don Johnson cross-country skiing, I wanted to do it too. His focus outside the traditional hook and bullet realm only helped increase his appeal to the readership of the Milwaukee Sentinel. In person, he also had a wry sense of humor and a warm personality. His dog is trying to get at his food in the campsite, and he's taking a rest. Don's work inspired me, no doubt, and one fateful day in 1994, I was hired as outdoors writer for the Racine Journal-Times. It was a decade after Don retired. Like many youngsters in many fields, I was intent on testing my mettle against others in my profession. I joined the Outdoor Writers Association of America and entered contests against writers from across the nation. In 1998, I won an award at the organization's annual convention in Florida. In a banquet hall crowded with 500 people, a man with twinkling eyes came toward me, hand extended. "I'm Don Johnson," he said. "You keep it up. It's important, hard, but fulfilling work. You never know where it will take you. I'm here today to tell you this man you've chosen to honor was much more than an outdoors writer. He was a role model in the best sense, and not just for a boy from Racine who grew up to be an outdoors writer." Don also encouraged Dave Carlson, Tim Isley, Dick Ellis, Steve Heiding, and Patrick Durkin, all of whom are leaders in our outdoor communication industry in the state today. Yes, Don Johnson defied stereotypes. He was strong, principled, hardworking, and talented, but also open-minded, kind, gracious, and compassionate. He could sit in a room full of Wisconsinites of any stripe or persuasion and have a respectful conversation. If the outdoor writing community could have an ambassador, I'd pick Don Johnson. Although Leopold said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community." With regard to our state's conservation community, what you have done is right by including Don Johnson in the elite membership of the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. I thank you for the honor to speak to you today.
So Representative Shanklin, can you join us again here? And Doug, would you like to come up and accept this on behalf of the family?
It's an honor to present this legislative citation. Know you by these presents. Whereas every year the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inducts a select group of individuals into the Hall of Fame to to recognize the important contributions each has made to natural resources management in the state. And whereas Don L Johnson has been chosen as a 2019 Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame inductee for his accomplished career writing about outdoor recreation and conservation, and his advocacy for environmental issues in Wisconsin and across the United States. And whereas Don grew up on family farms in Buffalo and Dodge counties, developing an early passion for the outdoors and inspiring him to attend the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he received degrees in both journalism and biology after completing his service in the Pacific Theater of World War II. And whereas Don used his education to establish a career as Wisconsin's premier environmental journalist and essayist, working in-house for outlets such as the Eau Claire Leader and Telegram and the Milwaukee Sentinel, and being published as a freelance writer in various outdoor-oriented publications. And whereas through this work, Don not only promoted general environmental advocacy, but he actively explored complex and often controversial public policy issues pertaining to wildlife management and environmental degradation during the genesis of the modern environmental movement, which contributed to Wisconsin becoming the first state in the union to ban the use of the pesticide DDT. And whereas he was also involved in significant public outreach programs, clinics, and workshops to educate citizens on safe and sustainable outdoor recreation practices, including Wisconsin's first hunter safety program. And whereas Don's persistent and focused advocacy for environmental policies and organizations helped establish significant and long-lasting institutions focused on the common missions of environmental protection, management, and conservation, including the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Now, therefore, the members of the Wisconsin Legislature do hereby commend Don L. Johnson for his lifelong dedication to conservation in Wisconsin and honor him for his induction into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Doug, before you wander off here, here is a copy, a replica of the plaque that you can take on behalf of the family house. I did want to mention, a couple of people mentioned the book that Don published, Summer Song and Other Essays. Unfortunately, it's a wonderful book. It really does show someone who loves the outdoors, and I truly enjoy reading this. Unfortunately, it's out of print. But one of our member organizations, the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin, has a dozen or so of these, which they use as a premium for one of their membership categories. So you can kind of accomplish two things at once by getting a really nice book and supporting the Natural Resources Foundation. And check that out and get a copy of the book. So thank you very much.